Chapter 5 of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty is all about how liberty and responsibility are inextricably linked with one another. First chunk of this chapter, Hayek sort of talks about why responsibility has fallen by the wayside and why he doesn't think that's good. So he starts off by saying modern people don't like responsibility for two main reasons. Second of the two reasons, less interesting, they think it's moralizing and pseudo-religious, and that just doesn't jive and appeal to them. Other reason, though, is that modern people think something that Hayek also thinks is probably true, that most of the things that happen to you in your life are probably accidents that are outside of your control. Your genetic makeup giving you whatever benefits or detriments that gives you, like your potential for your intelligence or height or physical strength or whatever, and the circumstances that you're born in, the education you get, the opportunities you receive throughout your life are entirely out of your control. And so most of what happens to you isn't up to you at all, so why should you be held responsible for outcomes? And Hayek's answer is purely instrumental. Holding you responsible for outcomes directs your attention to those things that you can control above those things that you cannot control. And that's a good thing because it makes you better able to use the knowledge you have to make good, positive choices that are effective. So then Hayek goes into this section where he talks about determinism and the threat that determinism might pose to responsibility. And actually comes down with the rather strikingly odd conclusion that determinism is actually a better fit with ideas about responsibility than libertarian ideas about free will are. So here's what he starts out with. He starts out with by saying, science appears to a lot of people face value to undermine free will. It repositions man as just being a part of nature, and if nature goes by the model of Newtonian classical physics, it's deterministic. One thing happens that causes another thing to happen, and it's all like dominoes falling down, like clockwork. What's going to happen is going to happen, and if man's a part of that, what he's going to do is what he's going to do. And this seems to a lot of people to undermine free will. Maybe quantum mechanics introduces some indeterminism back in. Hayek actually talks about this and mentions this very briefly, but that doesn't seem like it saves free will. It seems like it just introduces randomness into what we do, but doesn't give us back autonomy and the ability to make our own decisions. So then Hayek comes forward with the sort of classical compatibilist response, which is that all free will means is not actually having the ability to do one thing or the other. You don't actually have to be able to do one or the other. All it means is that the thing that you choose to do is the thing that you will to do, as opposed to the thing that somebody else wills you to do. Right? If somebody came and put a gun to your head and tried to force you to do something, well, that would clearly not be of your own free will. But as long as the decision is one that you make, even if that choice is determined by your genetics and by your culture, it's still one that you chose. Right? So that's sort of the classical compatibilist response. All that it means to have alternative actions open to you is that if your will had been different, you would have chosen something else. But it doesn't say anything to a compatibilist about whether it would have been possible for your will to be different given your genetics and the society around you. So for Hayek, this grounds responsibility. If your choices are entirely determined by the sort of inputs you get, well, giving you different inputs, telling you certain consequences are going to happen if you do this, that, or the other, well, that affects your behavior, which for Hayek is the point of holding people responsible. Whereas if you have a libertarian view, Hayek says, well, then there must be something standing outside the chain of causation that's making choices not on the basis of inputs at all, which it probably depends whether you're like an agent causal libertarian or an event causal libertarian. May even be getting those terms wrong, but or like a non-causal, whatever. Point is, it's kind of a cheap ploy in my opinion if you're going to go after libertarianism, philosophical libertarianism, not political libertarianism in this way. But Hayek, you do you. Basically, he's saying responsibility as a social construct of something we use for society makes more sense if determinism is true than if libertarianism is true. See my other video I mentioned earlier may not have mentioned it yet, my video on, I think I called it something like, "What is this picture anyway?" For sort of my take on free will in general. Okay. For Hayek, responsibility then is not really a fact. Like, it's not a fact that you're responsible or praiseworthy or blameworthy or anything like that. It's more of just a convention. It's not a claim that the world could have been different or about the ultimate causation of some event. Instead, it's just a claim that you're accessible to normal motives and considerations and beliefs about outcomes, and so we apply responsibility to you because you're accessible to those sorts of things. And as a result of this, it means that we should apply responsibility to people generally as opposed to only in specific cases. So he says, yeah, or not as a result of this, in spite of this, I should say. So the idea that he's bringing up here is, all right, we're using responsibility instrumentally, but that doesn't mean we should only apply consequences to people when, if they had known that consequence was going to happen, it would have changed their choice. You can imagine a murderer who would still commit the murder even if he knew he was going to be put in prison for the rest of his life. That doesn't mean we should let him go scot-free even if he'll never commit a murder again. We apply the consequence to him even though it wouldn't have affected his decision, because in general, consequences do, in fact, affect people's decisions. He also makes clear, as he moves into this next section, where instead of talking about why you might dislike responsibility as a concept, like determinism or influences being outside of our control, the good things about it, as he moves into that section, he also talks about how responsibility isn't just a legal concept, where you're held responsible for crimes you commit or for infractions against other people, like torts and things, but also a broader social and moral concept, where if you invest in the stock market and make a good decision, you're held responsible for that because you get to pay out a reward. And if you make a bad, poor decision, you suffer the consequence of that. Or moral, where if you lie to somebody, other people look down and ostracize you, even though you may not be doing something that is legally punishable. How holding people responsible in these other ways, besides for just breaking the law, is a good thing. Okay. So, in addition to that, Hayek thinks that people are part of the reason we hold them responsible is, even if they're not always in the best situation to make decisions with the information that they have available to them to try to achieve the best outcomes, they usually are in the best situation to make those sorts of decisions. And when they're not, it's not clear what other person is in a better situation than they are to make decisions about their life for them. So we hold them responsible and thereby, once again, direct their attention to doing the things that they need to do. A lot of people might say, well, people aren't rational, so it doesn't make sense to hold them responsible for all their decisions. Hayek says, on the contrary, it's true that people are not altogether rational. By holding them responsible, we allow the little scraps of rationality they do have to stretch as far as possible. Hayek does make some room for exceptions to the sorts of people and things we hold responsible, so you're not going to hold infants or children, people under age, responsible in the same way you're going to hold adults responsible. You're not going to hold truly insane people or people who are subject to like uncontrollable urges, like kleptomaniacs, responsible for everything they do, because those things are truly outside of their control. But you're going to have strict legal distinctions that break people into categories. In your personal relationships, Hayek says, you can sort of taper things off. You have a kid. As that kid gets older, you give him gradually more and more responsibility depending on what you think he's able to handle versus not able to handle. But you can't do that sort of tapering on a governmental or legal level. Instead, you have to have these sort of strict classes where you give people a metered out amount of responsibility if they meet the criterion for that class. And if they don't, they either get less or more, depending on what sort of class that they are in. Hayek also talks about how freedom is just as vital for altruism to work well as it is for selfishness to work well. If you're an altruistic person, whether that's altruism for people all around the world or altruism for your friends, family, and community, those near you. If you hold people responsible for the outcomes of their actions, then what you do is you allow them to pursue whatever their ranking is as well as is possible for them. So let's say 5 different people all have 5 radically different rankings of the sorts of things they value in the world. Well, if we have a government trying to enact altruism, even if 4 of those 5 people are altruistic, one of them wants to save the rainforests, one of them wants to take care of the elderly, one of them wants to do something else, one of them is going to probably end up sacrificing whatever altruistic thing is on the top of their ranking. But by holding individual people responsible for their own actions and allowing them to pursue their own ends and own goals, what you do is you allow them to place value on those altruistic ends that they personally value, as opposed to sacrificing the things one person values for another. Hayek goes into this bit about how you ultimately disrespect individuals' rights fundamentally if you disrespect people's ranking of values and the things that they find important and want to pursue with their life. So you let them enact plans that are going to wind up with outcomes that meet their goals, and then whatever the outcome of those plans are, they live with that particular outcome. He also says it's morally meaningless to attempt altruistic things without freedom. It's not praiseworthy. Good things are not praiseworthy without the possibility of choosing the wrong thing. So, yeah. He also talks briefly about leaving people open to censure. So holding them responsible in sort of this ostracization sort of a way for what they do, even if it isn't something that would economically or legally be something that would open them up to responsibility. Hayek has a bit in here that I find quite piercing of the heart, if you will, where he talks about how the main critique that he personally finds persuasive of capitalism is the critique that you could have someone who is very, very brilliant or good at things have their skills and abilities go to waste under capitalism. There's no one who's going to come in and say this person is talented, we're going to pluck him out and allow him to pursue whatever his ends are. We're not going to put this person in a place that's going to use his skills well. Instead, it's up to people themselves to use their opportunities as well as possible. In the free market, there's a very real problem of wasted potential because it's not ability that's important. Rather, it's putting the abilities you have to the highest use you can find for them, the one that other people are going to value as much as possible. And that sort of goal of putting your abilities to the best use possible just becomes more and more and more difficult as societies become more and more complex. In a simple society where there are 3 or 4 different roles you could have, it's pretty easy to find the one that's best for you. But in a society where there are hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of different possible things you could be doing, it's very, very difficult to find what your skills fit best in as the extent of the market grows. And on top of that, it's sad that people who have equal skill and put equal effort into the same sort of thing are going to have different outcomes because different opportunities present themselves to them. But Hayek talks about how your choice is one sort of, I don't want to say oppression, but one sort of constraint being traded for another. If you go from this sort of capitalist society to a socialist one, you're forcing people to live a certain particular sort of life, or you're forcing people at the very least to support people they don't necessarily agree with or think are best for the job. You're forcing someone to hire Joe Schmo, who you decided is the best at making televisions, as their television maker, and they don't have the option to go to someone else. You're trading off one sort of pressure of responsibility for the pressure of orders and the pressure of decisions coming from boards and groups and appointed officials and things like that, as opposed to the pressure coming from you being held responsible for making the best of convincing other people that what you have to offer is valuable. Hayek's very clear, free markets don't reward merit, they reward you giving concrete benefits to people who are able to reciprocate. Not necessarily some objective, pure standard of what's good, but of just you convincing other people who are able to do something for you that you can do something useful and helpful for them. Okay. Then he looks back to sort of a pre-industrial, feudal sort of society. And he talks about how the sorts of rewards that people get today for resourcefulness and sort of being pushy and forcing other people to find them are the exact sorts of things that older sorts of societies would frown upon. It used to be you had to wait your turn. People who had seniority over you, even if they weren't quite as good as what you did, were the ones who got it. And if you skipped over them, you were the villain. You were the bad guy. Those sorts of modern virtues of resourcefulness and pushiness and putting yourself out there were mainly fostered in minority communities. People who would have been the very last in line to get the opportunities had to push their way to the front of the line, essentially. And those sorts of minority virtues that Hayek talks about, he thinks are the most valuable today. He also talks briefly about how successful people, he notices, tend to be more likely to agree with him that responsibility is important. And someone might critique that by saying, well, yeah, people who are successful are of course going to say it was because of them and all the great things they did, and poor people are not going to want to take responsibility for that. Hayek says he thinks that causation is the other way around. He thinks that people who start in the same spot, one of them who has a belief that the outcomes that they see are going to be based on what they do, is going to wind up in a better spot in the end. Someone who believes in responsibility, who believes they have control over their own life, is going to wind up better off because they're going to have their attention again focused on the decisions that they can make that'll help them out, than somebody who believes that really their decisions can't affect much about their life. So he thinks the causation there is reversed. He doesn't think that it's rich people or successful people post hoc justifying why they deserve their place. He thinks it's people who think like that in the first place who get to those more successful places. All right. Final section of this chapter, Hayek talks about how the scope of responsibility in our society has, in addition to being diminished, like he's talked about for most of the chapter, has also been overextended. It's sort of the problem you see in television shows like The Good Place. Or I guess that's probably the only television show you'll see it in, but there's this sort of problem in The Good Place where it's very, very difficult to be good, because if you buy a blueberry muffin, you might be supporting slave labor in the third world. Indirectly. So Hayek says, all right, as society's grown more and more connected, we've had people saying we're responsible for things that happen further and further removed from us, which has a number of negative effects. One is, it should be possible to foresee and take into account the consequences of your actions, which is much easier when you're only held responsible for those immediate effects of your actions that you can see in the community nearby you and around you. Additionally, we lack knowledge of other places around the world and places that we may be held responsible in our modern society to help, that we don't lack knowledge for when it comes to our neighbors. We have a great deal of responsibility when it comes to, or not a great deal of responsibility, a great deal of knowledge of what will be good or bad for our neighbors, and so it makes more sense to hold them responsible than other people in other classes. Finally, or I guess not finally, we're almost there, holding you responsible for everything in the world, including things that you can't possibly control the results of, cheapens other forms of responsibility. So we can't hold you responsible for absolutely everything, because you can't possibly hold all of those things in your mind at once, and so then when we try to go back and hold you responsible for things closer to you, it cheapens those things that you actually do have more immediate effects and control over. He thinks that one of the things that's caused this sort of overextension, is the existence of cities, which diminish community. It used to be when you're in a smaller community, people take care of you, you take care of them. In a city where your money is being exchanged for your labor, it's not as personal, it's more impersonal. It's a lot harder to have those sorts of connections, and so that sort of degrades responsibility and also overextends it. It takes your impulse to have responsibility for those in your community and applies it over too large of a scale. Hayek thinks there is a very real trade-off between the security that you have by being in a community and the independence you get when you expand the scope of things and move into an urban setting. And he also thinks that the sort of city life leads to more of a clamoring for state intervention to bring back that security that you had in a community. But that will always, again, even if you do go in that direction, it'll decrease the independence that you gained from moving into the city in the first place. The government coming in and saying, oh, you don't need to be responsible for this anymore, we'll take care of you, necessarily moves you back towards having less freedom and less ability to choose things. So there's a trade-off there between security and choice. All right. Hope you've enjoyed this somewhat rambling take on Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, Chapter 5. I do hope you'll watch the other video, What the Hell is This Picture? Or whatever I ended up calling it. It kind of is sort of a summary of some different ways of thinking about responsibility and free will. All right, Chapter 6, coming soon.